Alexander squinted against the late afternoon sun, its golden rays filtering through the budding trees of the park. He sat stiffly on a weathered wooden bench, a newspaper clutched in his hands, its edges crinkling under his tightening grip. He wasn't reading it, hadn't even glanced at the headlines proclaiming some distant political drama. His eyes were elsewhere, darting through the colourful crowd of park visitors, joggers in bright spandex, elderly couples shuffling along the gravel paths, children chasing after pigeons with gleeful shrieks. And then, there she was. A familiar silhouette emerged from the kaleidoscope of movement, cutting through the chaos like a memory made flesh. Catherine. He didn't need a second look to know it was her. 15 years had passed, 15 long, hollow years, and yet he would recognize her anywhere, among thousands. The same gentle curve of her face, the same graceful stride that seemed to glide rather than step, the same quiet kindness radiating from her hazel eyes. She wore a light blue coat, unbuttoned despite the early spring chill, and her chestnut hair was swept into a loose bun, strands fluttering free in the breeze. She looked timeless, almost unchanged. Almost. There was something different about her now, something Alexander couldn't quite place at first. A subtle shift in the way she carried herself, a newfound confidence, a quiet strength that hadn't been there when they'd shared a life together. And then he saw them, the children trailing behind her. 3 boys, 2 older ones, lanky and awkward, maybe 14 or so, their dark hair tousled, and their voices rising in a playful argument over a soccer ball they kicked between them. The third was much younger, no more than 5, clinging to her hand with chubby fingers, his wide eyes taking in the world as he toddled along. Alexander froze, the newspaper slipping slightly in his grasp, his breath caught in his throat, sharp and cold, as if the air itself had turned to ice. Catherine and children? It couldn't be. His mind reeled, grasping for some explanation, some anchor to steady the sudden vertigo of the moment. Were they her sister's kids? A friend's? But no, there was too much in the way she looked at them, the tender tilt of her head as she bent to listen to the youngest one's babbling, the gentle laugh she gave as the older boys jostled each other. It was a mother's gaze, unmistakable and profound. Memories crashed over him like a tidal wave, icy and relentless. Their marriage flickered before his eyes. Those early years of hope, the quiet evenings spent dreaming of a family, the way Catherine's face would light up at the sight of a stroller rolling by. Then the darker days, the endless doctor visits, the sterile white walls of clinics, the specialists with their clipped voices and pitying eyes delivering the verdict. Infertility, unexplained, irreversible. Alexander could still feel the weight of his own despair, the way it had crushed him, turned him inward. He remembered her tears, the way she'd curled into herself on their couch, her soft sobs filling the silence he couldn't break. And he remembered the end, the divorce papers signed in a haze of resignation, the belief that it was inevitable, that they couldn't survive the void where their dreams had once lived. "Excuse me, sir. Are you done with that?" The voice jolted him back to the present. A teenage girl stood in front of him, her backpack slung over one shoulder, gesturing at the newspaper. Alexander blinked, disoriented, then handed it over with a mumbled, "Yeah, sure." She flashed a quick smile and darted off, leaving him alone again with the chaos of his thoughts. He ran a hand through his greying hair, tugging at the strands as if he could pull some clarity from the gesture. His heart thudded unevenly in his chest. He needed to calm down, to think this through. Maybe he was jumping to conclusions. Maybe those boys weren't hers. But even as he tried to convince himself, doubt gnawed at him. The resemblance was there. The older ones had her high cheekbones, her steady gaze. The little one. God, the little one even had her smile, that same crooked tilt that used to make Alexander's mornings brighter. He stood abruptly, his knees protesting after too long on the hard bench. The sun was dipping lower now, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the park. Catherine and the boys were moving further away, toward the playground near the pond. He could hear their laughter faintly on the wind, one of the older boys shouting, "Bet I can swing higher than you," while the younger one tugged at Catherine's coat, whining, "Mama, push me!" "Mama." The word hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He staggered back a step, gripping the edge of the bench for support. So it was true. She had children. She had a family. After everything they'd been through, after all the years he'd spent convincing himself she'd suffered as much as he had, she'd found a way forward. And he hadn't. He watched her kneel beside the swing set, lifting the youngest boy into the seat with a practiced ease. Her voice carried faintly as she said, "Hold on tight, Sammy. Here we go." The boy squealed in delight as she gave the swing a gentle push, her smile warm and unguarded. The older boys were already clambering onto the higher swings, daring each other with reckless teenage bravado. Alexander's throat tightened. He should leave. He should turn around, walk back to his car, drive to his empty apartment, and let this moment fade into the past where it belonged. But his feet wouldn't move. He needed to know more. How had this happened? When? Who was the father? Had she remarried? The questions burned in his mind, each one sharper than the last. "Hey, Alex, you okay over there?" He flinched, turning to see an old man on the next bench over, his weathered face creased with concern. It was Mr. Hargrove, a regular at the park who'd taken to chatting with Alexander on his occasional visits. The man's roomy eyes studied him over the rim of his glasses. "Yeah, I'm fine," Alexander lied, forcing a tight smile. "Just lost in thought." "Looks like more than that," Mr. Hargrove said with a knowing grunt, nodding toward Catherine and the boys. "Someone you know?" Alexander hesitated, then shook his head. Not anymore. The old man hummed thoughtfully but didn't press. Alexander was grateful for that. He didn't have the words to explain, not to Mr. Hargrove, not to himself. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the park lights flickered on, bathing the scene in a soft, artificial glow. Catherine was gathering the boys now, brushing dirt off the youngest one's knees as the older two argued over who'd won their swinging contest. She looked happy. Whole. Alexander felt a pang of something he couldn't name, regret, envy, longing, all tangled together in a knot beneath his ribs. He was alone. The realization hit him harder than it ever had before. The city stretched out around him, swallowed by darkness, and he felt its emptiness mirrored inside him. All these years he'd thrown himself into his work, chasing promotions, accolades, the corner office with the view. He'd told himself it was enough, that he didn't need anything else. But watching Catherine with her boys, he saw the lie he'd been living. None of it mattered. Not the titles, not the money. Without family, without children, without love. Memories washed over Alexander in relentless waves, pulling him under, back to the days when his love for Catherine had been a fire that consumed everything else. It had all started at an architectural exhibition, a bustling gallery filled with sleek models of glass towers and blueprints pinned to white walls. She'd been standing by a display of sustainable urban designs, her auburn hair catching the light, her hazel eyes bright with curiosity. A young doctor brimming with energy and compassion, she'd asked him a question about one of his sketches, something about green rooftops, and he'd been hooked. He, an aspiring architect with grand dreams of reshaping skylines, had found in her a kindred spirit. They were united by a shared passion for life, a hunger to create something enduring, something that would outlive them both. Their courtship was a whirlwind of late-night conversations over cheap wine, walks through the city's cobblestone streets, and sketches of imaginary homes they'd build together. Within a year, they were married in a small ceremony at the courthouse, her in a simple white dress, him in a borrowed suit, both of them grinning like fools. Their apartment became their fortress, a third-floor walk-up with high ceilings and wide windows that overlooked a quiet courtyard shaded by a single gnarled oak. The walls were bare at first, but soon they hung his blueprints alongside her medical certificates, a testament to their dreams. They'd sit on the sagging couch they'd bought second-hand, her legs draped over his, and talk about the future, about children, about the sound of laughter echoing off the parquet floors, about little feet leaving smudges on the glass coffee table. But time passed, and the future they'd envisioned refused to take shape. Months turned to years, and the cherished 2 lines on a pregnancy test never appeared. The first doctor's visit was casual, almost optimistic. "These things take time," the woman had said, adjusting her glasses with a reassuring smile. But then came more visits, more tests, blood draws, ultrasounds, charts filled with numbers neither of them understood. Hope eroded into despair, faith into a hollow disappointment that settled between them like dust. The final verdict came in a sterile office, delivered by a grey-haired specialist whose voice was too calm, too clinical. Unexplained infertility. "I'm afraid there's little more we can do naturally." The words shattered their crystalline dreams, fragile as a castle built on sand, leaving nothing but jagged shards in their wake. Alexander remembered how Catherine cried at night, her face buried in the pillow to muffle the sound. He'd lie beside her in their 2-big bed, the sheets cool against his skin, and reach for her. His arms would wrap around her trembling frame, her breath hitching against his chest, and he'd whisper, "It's okay, we'll figure it out," even though he didn't believe it. He tried to comfort her, to be her anchor, but he felt helpless, adrift in his own storm. His suffering was quieter, more inward. He'd always dreamed of a child who'd inherit his dark eyes or his stubborn jaw, a little person who'd tug at his sleeve and call him Dad, with wide-eyed admiration. That dream had rooted deep in him, a need he couldn't shake. One evening, over a dinner of cold leftovers neither of them had the energy to heat, Catherine brought up IVF. Her voice was tentative, a fragile thread of hope. "It could work, Alex. I've been reading about it. Hormones, transfers. It's a chance." He'd nodded, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Yeah, let's try it." It was a lifeline, a flickering light in the dark kingdom of their despair, and they seized it with both hands. The clinic became their second home, a maze of sterile corridors that smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. They navigated it together, Catherine enduring hormone injections that left her bruised and irritable, Alexander holding her hand through procedures that made her wince. Each attempt was a cycle of unbearable waiting, days stretching into weeks, punctuated by phone calls with nurses whose voices grew heavier with each negative result. The first failure was a punch to the gut, the second a crack in their foundation. By the third, they barely spoke on the drive home, the silence between them thicker than the fog outside. One rainy afternoon, after another call confirming yet another loss, Catherine sat at their kitchen table, her hands trembling around a chipped mug of tea. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this anymore, Alex," she said, staring into the steam. "I can't keep torturing myself. Or you. Maybe this isn't for us. Maybe we're meant to be just the 2 of us." Alexander leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his jaw tight. He was tired too, exhausted by the sleepless nights, the constant tension, the guilt that gnawed at him every time he saw her flinch from a needle. He felt like a failure, unable to give her the one thing she wanted most, unable to fix what was broken. But her words stirred something deeper, a decision he'd been burying for months, too afraid to voice. He looked away, out the rain-streaked window, and said, "I can't live without children, Catherine." His voice cracked, betraying the weight of it. "I want to be a father. I can't imagine my life without that. I don't know how to let it go." She didn't respond right away. The kitchen was silent save for the patter of rain against the glass. When he finally turned to face her, she was watching him, her eyes shimmering with tears but steady with a painful understanding. "Okay," she said simply, her voice soft but resolute. There was no anger in it, no blame, just the quiet acceptance of a truth they'd both been circling. Divorce crept in like an inevitability, a slow tide they couldn't outrun. Alexander was the one who pushed for it, though it tore at him to do so. He couldn't stay in a life where his deepest longing would remain unfulfilled. He felt it would break him, erode him into someone bitter and hollow. He didn't blame Catherine. How could he? She hadn't chosen this any more than he had. He blamed fate, the doctors with their useless charts, himself for not being enough. They parted without fanfare, no shouting matches, no accusations flung across the room. They'd once loved each other fiercely, wholly, but the obstacle between them had grown into a mountain neither could climb. The day he moved out, the apartment felt cavernous without her. He packed his drafting table, his books, his half-finished sketches of dream houses, and left behind the life they'd built. She stood in the doorway as he loaded the last box into his car, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. "Take care of yourself, Alex," she'd said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. He'd nodded, unable to meet her eyes, and driven away. After the divorce, Alexander threw himself into the only thing he had left: his work. Architecture became his refuge, a way to drown out the howling pain and loneliness that echoed through his nights. He took on project after project, sprawling suburban houses with manicured lawns, gleaming shopping centres lined with glass storefronts, towering office buildings that scraped the city skyline. His hands moved tirelessly over drafting tables, sketching lines and angles until his fingers cramped, the faint smell of graphite and ink grounding him. Each completed structure was a triumph, a monument to his discipline, his drive. But none of them filled the hollow space in his chest. The houses he built stood empty of the laughter he'd once imagined, the offices buzzed with strangers who'd never know his name. Success piled up around him, awards on his shelf, a sleek downtown apartment with a view of the river. But it was a cold, brittle thing, unable to warm the emptiness where Catherine had once been. He tried to move on. There were women, smart, beautiful women who laughed at his dry humour or admired his sharp mind. A lawyer with a quick wit who shared his love of jazz. A painter with wild curls who left streaks of colour on his shirt sleeve during late-night talks. But none of them were her. None had her quiet strength, her way of tilting her head when she listened, her ability to see through his guarded exterior to the man beneath. Each relationship fizzled out, leaving him more certain of his mistake. He'd let Catherine go, convinced he couldn't live without fatherhood, only to realise too late that he couldn't live without her. The irony gnawed at him, a bitter pill he swallowed alone in the dark. The memories snapped off abruptly, like a film reel jamming in its projector, and Alexander found himself back in the present, the park's evening chill seeping into his bones. Catherine and her boys had disappeared beyond the playground, their laughter fading into the hum of the city. He couldn't just stand there, paralysed by questions. He needed answers, needed to understand how she'd built the life he'd walked away from. His architect's mind kicked in, methodical and precise. He'd start with the people who might know, the threads that still connected their unravelled past. First, he reached out to Susan, Catherine's old colleague from the hospital. They'd met her for coffee a few times after the divorce, back when civility still masked the ache. Susan's voice crackled through the phone, warm and familiar, as they exchanged pleasantries about the weather and her new promotion. Alexander kept his tone casual, steering the conversation gently. "How's Catherine these days?" he asked, leaning against his kitchen counter, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating in his hand. "Oh, Kathy's doing great," Susan said brightly. "Still the same old dynamo, works hard at the hospital, but you'd never know it from her attitude. Always so positive. Her kids are wonderful, though, all so different but sharp as tacks. That woman never complains, just keeps everything running like clockwork." Alexander's grip tightened on the glass, Susan's words searing into him. Her kids. The phrase was a blade, and then came the twist. She does everything herself. "Herself?" he echoed, his voice catching slightly. He cleared his throat to cover it. "No. No husband in the picture, then?" Susan laughed, a light surprised sound. No, why would she? Kathy's all about those boys. I've never seen anyone else around her. Not a boyfriend, not a partner. She manages everything herself. Always has. Her tone was admiring, but to Alexander it felt like a quiet reproach, a reminder of what he'd abandoned. He thanked her, hung up, and stood motionless, the whiskey trembling in his hand. No husband. No remarriage. Hope flickered in his chest, irrational and wild. If she was alone, could those boys be his? But how? The impossibility of it coiled around his mind, tightening with every breath. Next, he called Michael, an old family friend who'd been a steady presence through their marriage. A gruff, bearish man with a knack for cutting through bullshit. Michael had treated them like his own kids, hosting barbecues in his cluttered backyard, offering unsolicited advice over bottles of beer. If anyone knew the truth, it'd be him. Alexander dialed, his palms damp, his voice unsteady as he began. Hello, Michael. Long time no see. How are you holding up? Alex! Michael's voice boomed through the line, rough but warm. Hell, it's good to hear from you. I'm still kicking, knees are shot, but the grill's still hot. How's life treating you these days? They traded small talk, Michael's latest fishing trip, Alexander's newest project, before Alexander nudged the conversation forward, his pulse thudding in his ears. I ran into Catherine the other day. Saw her with some kids. What's that about? Silence stretched across the line, thick and heavy. Alexander held his breath, the receiver slick against his cheek. When Michael finally spoke, his tone was careful, measured. Kathy's amazing, Alex. She's raised 3 boys on her own. It's been tough, God knows it has, but she manages. Always does. I don't understand, Alexander muttered, more to himself than to Michael. His voice dropped, raw and unguarded. How is this possible? We couldn't have children. The doctors said. Life's complicated, Michael interrupted, his words slow, deliberate. Kathy's a strong woman, stronger than most. She did everything she could to make it work. There was a pause, a rustle, as if Michael was shifting in his chair. Alexander seized the opening, his mind racing. Did she adopt them? Is that it? Another hesitation, longer this time. Well, Michael said at last, let's just say there was no adoption, but they've got her last name, Miller, all 3 of them. The words hit Alexander like a fist to the sternum, knocking the air from his lungs. He sank into a chair, the phone trembling against his ear. Her last name, Catherine Miller. If they were Millers, it meant she'd given birth to them, carried them, named them. But how? His mind scrambled for footing. Had medicine leaped forward in the years since their divorce, finding a way past their infertility? Thanks, Michael, he managed, his voice hoarse. Good talking to you. Take care, Alex, Michael replied, a note of unease lingering as the call ended. Alexander set the phone down, staring blankly at the wall. The pieces didn't fit, not yet, but they were starting to form a shape, shadowy and incomplete. Catherine, alone, raising 3 boys with her name. No husband, no adoption, just her and the children he'd seen in the park. He needed more. Documents, records, something concrete. The architect in him demanded precision, proof. But the man in him, the one who'd never stopped loving her, just wanted to see her again, to ask the question burning in his throat. How? Alexander knew he couldn't unravel this tangle alone. His mind churned with half-formed theories and desperate hopes, but he needed perspective, someone who could see what he couldn't. That meant Raymond, his best friend since college, the one who'd stood by him through every storm, even the wreckage of his divorce. Raymond had a knack for cutting through Alexander's stubbornness, his quiet sensitivity a counterpoint to Alexander's relentless drive. If anyone could help him make sense of this, it was him. They met at a small cafe tucked into a side street, its faded awning fluttering in the breeze. The air smelled of roasted coffee and burnt sugar, and the clatter of porcelain cups filled the space as Alexander slid into a booth across from Raymond. His friend looked much the same, wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, a mop of Sammy hair just starting to grey, a flannel shirt rolled up at the sleeves. But his eyes, sharp and knowing, locked onto Alexander with an intensity that made him fidget. "I saw Catherine," Alexander blurted, skipping the usual small talk. He leaned forward, elbows on the scratched wooden table, his coffee untouched. "In the park. She had kids with her. 3 boys. I can't stop thinking about it, Ray. I've got suspicions, questions. I need to know what's going on." Raymond set his mug down slowly, steam curling between them. He sighed, a long, weary sound that carried the weight of years. "You know, Alex," he said, his voice low, "I always thought you made a mistake divorcing Kathy. She loved you, really loved you, more than you ever gave her credit for." Alexander flinched, guilt twisting in his gut like a knife. He stared at the table, tracing a crack in the wood with his fingertip. "I know," he admitted, his voice rough. "I know she did. But back then, I thought I couldn't be happy without kids. I thought it was the only thing that mattered." "And are you happy now?" Raymond's question was gentle but piercing, like a scalpel slipping past defenses. Alexander froze, his breath catching. The silence stretched, heavy and accusing. He couldn't answer, not honestly. His life was a sterile shell of achievements, a hollow frame with no warmth inside. Raymond didn't wait for a reply. He leaned back, folding his arms. "Listen, Alex. I don't know all the details. Hell, I don't know half of what she's been through. But I can tell you this. It's not as simple as it seems. Kathy's been through a lot, more than you can imagine. She's fought for her happiness. And those kids? They're it. They're her world. Don't ruin that for her." "I'm not trying to ruin anything," Alexander shot back, his voice rising before he caught himself. He lowered it, glancing around the cafe to see if anyone had noticed. "I just want the truth, Ray. I have a right to know if those boys—" He stopped, the words tangling in his throat. "If they're mine." Raymond's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing him with a look that made Alexander feel small. "A right?" he repeated, incredulity lacing the word. "What right do you have, Alex? You walked away from her. You chose to leave, to chase some dream of fatherhood that didn't include her. You had your chance, years of it, and you missed it. Maybe you should just let her be." "I can't," Alexander whispered, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "I can't just leave it like this. There's too much at stake, too much I don't understand. I need to know, even if it kills me." Raymond sighed again, rubbing a hand over his face. "All right," he said finally, his tone resigned. "I've warned you. But remember this. Sometimes the truth hurts more than the wondering. It doesn't always bring relief. It can break you all over again." He picked up his coffee, took a sip, and added, "Just don't say I didn't tell you so." The conversation left Alexander reeling, a storm of confusion and resolve warring inside him. Raymond's words stung, each one a mirror reflecting the choices he'd made, the life he'd lost. He'd missed his chance. Of that there was no doubt. But walking away now, leaving this mystery unsolved, felt like abandoning something vital, something he couldn't name. The only path forward was through Catherine herself. She held the answers, and he had to face her. It took him hours to work up the nerve to call. He paced his apartment, the hardwood floors creaking under his restless steps, the phone a lead weight in his pocket. When he finally dialed her number, still etched in his memory after all these years, his heart hammered so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. The line rang once, twice, and then her voice came through, soft and familiar, slicing through the years like a blade. "Hello?" "Kathy, it's Alexander," he said, his mouth dry as sandpaper. The words tumbled out clumsy and rushed. "We need to talk." Silence crackled on the line, stretching so long he thought she'd hang up. His pulse thudded in his ears, each second an eternity. Then, faintly, she said, "All right." Her tone was guarded, unreadable, but it was enough. They agreed to meet in 2 days at a quiet cafe on the city's outskirts, a neutral spot, far from the memories of their old haunts. Alexander hung up, his hand trembling as he set the phone down. He closed his eyes, leaning against the wall, the cool plaster grounding him as his mind spun. 2 days. 48 hours that stretched ahead like a chasm. Time crawled. He couldn't eat. The thought of food turned his stomach. Sleep eluded him. He lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, shadows shifting across it like ghosts of their past. His mind raced, rehearsing every possible scenario. He practiced questions, apologies, pleas. None of them felt right. Catherine wouldn't lie to him. He knew that much. Her honesty had always been a quiet strength, a lighthouse in their storms. But that same honesty might shatter him. On the day of the meeting, Alexander arrived at the cafe 20 minutes early, the weight of anticipation pressing down on him like a physical force. The place was a modest little spot on the city's edge, its faded green shutters framing windows streaked with morning mist. He chose a table by the glass where he could watch the world drift by, dog walkers, delivery bikes, a mother pushing a stroller, while his mind churned. His fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the scratched tabletop, the sound swallowed by the hum of the espresso machine and the murmur of other patrons. What would he say to her? How would she react to his questions, his prodding at a past they'd both buried? He sipped his coffee, barely tasting it, the bitter heat doing little to steady his nerves. The clock above the counter ticked relentlessly, each second stretching his anxiety tauter. Then the bell above the door jingled, and she was there. Catherine stepped inside, her coat dusted with a fine drizzle, her hair pulled back in a loose braid that glistened with moisture. He almost didn't recognize her at first. Time had etched faint lines around her eyes, and there was a weariness in her posture that hadn't been there before. But her gaze, when it met his, burned with a determined fire, a resilience that made his chest ache. She crossed the room with that same graceful stride he'd always known, sliding into the seat across from him without a word, her hands folding neatly in her lap. She just looked at him, steady and unreadable, waiting. Alexander cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet space between them. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice hoarse, betraying the sleepless nights that had led to this moment. He set his cup down, the porcelain clinking against the saucer. "I wanted to talk about the children." Catherine's eyes flickered, not with anger or resentment, but with a deep, quiet sadness that pierced him more than any glare could have. "I know," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of inevitability. "I was expecting this question." She fell silent again, her gaze steady, inviting him to press on. He swallowed, his throat tight. "I need to know, Kathy. How did you have children?" The words tumbled out, raw and urgent, and he saw her face harden, her jaw tightening as she turned to stare out the window. The street outside blurred into a watercolor of grey and muted colors, people hurrying past, oblivious to the storm brewing at this table. "It's none of your business, Alex," she said, her tone flat, final, like a door slamming shut. "None of my business?" The restraint he'd been clinging to snapped, and his voice rose sharp and incredulous. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "After everything we went through, years of trying, all those tears, all that hope, I have a right to know." "A right?" She turned back to him, her scoff cutting through the air like a whip. Bitterness edged her words, a rare crack in her calm facade. "You gave up that right when you left, Alex. When you decided children were more important than me, than us. You don't get to walk back in now and demand answers." Her words landed like a blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He slumped back in his seat, stunned into silence. She was right. He couldn't deny it. He'd made that choice driven by a longing he'd thought was noble only to find it hollow. But the truth still clawed at him, a need he couldn't bury. "Please, Kathy," he whispered, his voice breaking, a plea stripped of pride. She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling as if she was steeling herself for a battle she'd hoped to avoid. When she met his eyes again, there was pain there, exhaustion etched into the lines of her face, but also a firmness, a strength he hadn't fully seen in her before. After the divorce, she began, her voice low but steady, I couldn't just give up. I couldn't let go of our dream, of my dream. I knew we had frozen embryos at the clinic. Alexander froze, his breath catching. Memories flooded back, the sterile rooms, the endless forms, the vials of hope they'd pinned their future on. He remembered signing the consent to store those embryos, a last-ditch just-in-case they'd agreed on, in a moment of fragile optimism. He'd assumed it all ended with their marriage, discarded like their shared plans. You continued trying without me? His voice trembled, disbelief warring with a dawning realization. Yes, Alex, I did. She straightened, unapologetic, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. I knew it might seem selfish, even crazy, but I couldn't help it. I had to try. For myself, for the life I still wanted. I went back to the clinic, used what was left of us. And? He held his breath, the world narrowing to her next words. The first few attempts didn't work, she said, and the sadness in her voice was a tangible thing, wrapping around them both. Each failure broke me a little more. I'd sit in that empty apartment, staring at the walls, thinking I'd lost everything, our dream, you, any chance at being a mother. I'd almost given up. But then, a miracle happened. I got pregnant, with twins. The room tilted beneath him, his heartbeat a deafening roar in his ears. Twins, his sons. The older boys from the park, their dark hair, their steady gazes flashed in his mind. They were his, born from the embers of a life he'd abandoned. Twins, he whispered, awe threading through the word. That's incredible. It was incredibly hard, she cut in, her voice sharp with memory. Alone, Alex. No partner, no support, just me, figuring it out step by step. The sleepless nights, the hospital bills, the fear I wasn't enough. But I managed. They're my life, Chris and Noah. They're everything. He nodded, dazed, still processing the enormity of it. Then another thought surfaced, urgent and insistent. And the youngest? He's about 5, right? Catherine's gaze flickered away, a shadow crossing her face. She traced the rim of her untouched water glass with a finger, her silence stretching taut. That's another story, Alex, she said finally, her voice quieter now, guarded. What happened? He leaned forward, desperation surging. He needed the full picture, every piece of this puzzle she'd built without him. Please, Kathy, don't shut me out now. She exhaled, a long, shaky breath, and looked back at him, her resolve wavering but holding. I was working at the maternity hospital, she began, her words measured. One night, a newborn boy was left there, just hours old, wrapped in a blanket, no note, no name. His mother had walked out, abandoned him. I was on shift when they brought him in, this tiny, helpless thing crying in the bassinet. Alexander listened, his chest tightening, barely daring to breathe as she continued. I couldn't let him be alone, she said, her voice thickening with emotion. I'd seen too many kids shuffled into the system, lost in orphanages, forgotten. I knew I could give him love, a home, everything I'd fought so hard to build for the twins. I became his guardian at first, then adopted him legally. His name's Samuel. He stared at her, awe washing over him like a tide. Catherine, this woman he'd once known so well yet not at all, hadn't just defied their shared curse of infertility. She'd reached beyond it, taken a child no one else wanted, and woven him into her family with the same fierce love she'd given their twins. Does he know? Alexander asked, his voice hushed. That you're not his biological mother? Yes, she replied, a faint, proud smile softening her features. We've always been honest with him. The twins, too. They know Sammy's story. He's part of us, Alex, just as much as they are. We love him the same. Alexander sat motionless at the cafe table, the echo of Catherine's words reverberating in his skull. The clatter of dishes and the murmur of voices faded into a dull hum as he processed the revelations. Twins born from their frozen embryos, a third child adopted from abandonment. His sons, his blood, and another he might have loved if he'd stayed. The weight of it crushed him, a landslide of missed years and lost chances burying the man he'd been. He'd turned his back on a family that could have been his, and now he was relegated to the sidelines, a spectator to a life he'd helped create but never claimed. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked, resentment seeping through the question like ink through paper. He leaned forward, searching her face as she lingered by the table, coat already half-buttoned. "Why did you keep this from me, Kathy?" She met his gaze, her hazel eyes steady but tinged with exhaustion. "Because you left, Alex," she said simply, her tone devoid of malice but heavy with truth. "You made your choice, walked out on me, on us. I didn't want to drag you back into my life, risk you tearing it apart again. I was afraid you'd try to take the children away, or worse, hurt me all over again by walking out a second time." "I would never," he started, his voice rising in protest, but the words faltered, dying in his throat. He stopped, hands clenching into fists on the table. Could he honestly say that? If he'd known about the twins years ago, what would he have done? Fought for custody, demanded a role he hadn't earned? He didn't know, and that uncertainty silenced him. Catherine's expression softened just slightly. "I don't blame you, Alex," she said, her voice weary, worn thin by years of carrying this alone. "I stopped blaming you a long time ago, but I can't change the past, not for you, not for me." He looked up at her, desperation flickering in his chest like a fragile flame. "What should I do then?" he asked, his tone softer now, laced with a faint, trembling hope. "What can I do to make you believe I'm not that man anymore?" She studied him for a long moment, her scrutinizing gaze piercing through the layers he'd built over the years. "Time will tell, Alexander," she said finally, her voice firm but not unkind. "Time will tell if you mean it." She turned then, pulling her coat tighter around her, and walked out without another word. The bell above the door jingled faintly as it swung shut behind her. Alexander stayed rooted to the seat, staring at the empty space where she'd been. The mystery was unravelled, the how, the why, but instead of relief, a heaviness settled deep in his chest, a stone of regret and longing he couldn't dislodge. She'd given him the truth, raw and unvarnished, and now it was his to carry. He paid the bill in a daze, leaving a crumpled tip on the table, and stepped out into the drizzle-soaked street, the future stretching before him like an uncharted blueprint. He decided to start small, to build something from the ashes of what he'd learned. During their conversation, Catherine had mentioned offhand that one of the twins, Chris, had a big soccer game the next day, a championship match he'd been training for all season. Alexander seized on it, a fragile thread to follow. He arrived at the field early, the grass still damp with morning dew, and climbed into the bleachers among a sea of parents clutching thermoses and cheering banners. He felt out of place, a stranger in this world of suburban rituals, his dark jacket and unshaven jaw drawing curious glances from the moms and dads around him. He ignored them, focusing on the field as the teams warmed up. Chris was easy to spot, tall for 14, with Catherine's high cheekbones and a mop of dark hair bouncing as he jogged. The whistle blew, and the game erupted into motion. Alexander watched, rapt, as Chris darted across the turf, fast and agile, weaving past opponents with a grace that reminded him of Catherine's own quiet determination. He scored twice, once with a sharp kick that sent the crowd roaring, again with a header that left the goalie sprawling. Pride swelled in Alexander's chest, unbidden and bittersweet. He had no right to it, no claim to this boy's triumphs, but he felt it anyway, a phantom ache for what might have been. After the final whistle blew, Chris's team victorious, Alexander lingered by the sidelines, watching the boy high-five his teammates, his face flushed with exertion and joy. Steeling himself, he approached, his boots sinking into the muddy grass. "Hi," he said, his voice trembling despite his effort to steady it. "I just wanted to say you played great out there." Chris turned, wiping sweat from his brow, and squinted at him with a puzzled frown. "Thanks," he said, polite but guarded, his tone carrying the wariness of youth faced with an unfamiliar adult. "I'm, a friend of your mom's," Alexander added, feeling like an idiot the moment the words left his mouth. He shoved his hands into his pockets, awkwardness radiating from him. "Oh," Chris said, nodding slowly. "Okay." He shifted his weight, glancing toward his teammates, clearly unsure what else to say. The exchange ended there, a brick wall of silence rising between them. Alexander walked back to his car, discouragement gnawing at him, but he didn't let it take root. This was a start, however clumsy. He couldn't undo the past in a single conversation, couldn't expect Chris to see him as anything but a stranger. Time, Catherine had said. He'd give it time. Over the next few weeks, he edged closer to their lives, step by cautious step. He began visiting Catherine and the boys regularly, always with her permission, never pushing too hard. He'd show up at their modest house on the edge of town, a 2-story with peeling paint and a yard littered with bikes and soccer balls, armed with small offerings, a pizza for dinner, a new pack of coloured pencils for homework. He helped the twins with math problems at the kitchen table, marvelling at their quick minds despite his fumbling explanations. He played with Sammy on the living room rug, racing toy cars across imaginary tracks while the boys' giggles filled the air. Once he took them all to a matinee at the local theatre, a superhero flick they'd chatted about for days, watching their faces light up in the flickering dark. He kept his role simple: a friend, a helper, nothing more. He didn't dare call himself a father, didn't presume to step into shoes he hadn't earned. The twins warmed to him slowly, their initial suspicions softening into cautious acceptance. Chris started asking him about buildings, how they stayed up, why they didn't fall, and Noah once flashed him a shy grin over a shared joke. Sammy, bright and fearless at 5, took to him faster, calling out, "Alex!" in his high, piping voice and thrusting picture books into his hands for bedtime stories. Catherine observed it all from a distance, her presence quiet but watchful. She'd linger in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression a mix of cautious optimism and lingering doubt. She saw his effort, the genuine care in his actions, but the scars of their past ran deep. One evening, as he shrugged into his jacket to leave, she stopped him at the threshold. The house was still behind her, the boys' voices hushed upstairs, the air thick with the scent of the spaghetti they'd cooked together. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but clear. "Thank you for what you're doing. For them." She stepped closer, hesitating only a moment before brushing her lips against his cheek. It was fleeting, a whisper of contact, but it ignited a spark in Alexander's chest, a glimmer of hope he hadn't dared to nurse. He stood there, stunned as she pulled back, her eyes searching his for a heartbeat before she turned away. The door clicked shut behind her, and he stepped into the cool night, the memory of her touch lingering like a promise or a question. Despite his persistent efforts, Alexander felt an unyielding chasm stretching between him and the twins, a gulf of years and choices he couldn't bridge. They welcomed him into their lives as Uncle Alex, a friendly figure who brought pizza and cracked jokes, but the word father remained unspoken, a boundary he couldn't cross. He watched them laugh and argue, their voices filling Catherine's home with a warmth he'd once dreamed of, yet he remained on the outside, a guest in their world rather than a cornerstone. The ache of it gnawed at him, a quiet despair beneath his every smile. One crisp afternoon, as golden leaves drifted across the backyard, Alexander sat with Chris on the porch steps, tossing a soccer ball between his hands. The boy had been quieter lately, more thoughtful, and Alexander wondered if he sensed the weight of the unspoken. Then, out of the blue, Chris fixed him with a steady gaze and asked, "Uncle Alex, did you ever want to have children?" The question hit like a thunderclap, catching Alexander off guard. His breath hitched, the soccer ball slipping from his grasp to roll into the grass. He stared at Chris, his son, his mirror in so many ways, searching for words that wouldn't unravel everything too soon. "Yes," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I always dreamed of having children. It was one of the biggest dreams I ever had." Chris tilted his head, his dark eyes narrowing with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Then why don't you have any?" The air thickened, time slowing as Alexander's mind raced. How could he explain it? The love he'd shared with Catherine, the despair that shattered it, the years he'd spent running from his own longing only to find it staring back at him in this boy's face. How could he tell Chris he was his child, that he'd given him up before he'd even known he existed? "It's a long story," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe someday I'll tell you about it." Chris studied him for a moment, skepticism lingering in the set of his jaw, but he didn't press. He just nodded, kicking at a pebble with his sneaker, and let the silence settle. That evening, as Alexander drove home under a sky streaked with dusk, the weight of that question pressed down on him. He couldn't keep hiding, not from them, not from himself. The twins deserved the truth, his past, his mistakes, his regret. They deserved the chance to decide if they'd let him be more than a peripheral figure in their lives. He needed to lay it all bare, consequences be damned. He broached the idea with Catherine that night, standing in her kitchen as the scent of baked chicken lingered from dinner. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her expression a mix of apprehension and resolve. "They're old enough to hear it," he said, his voice low but firm. "I need to tell them who I am, Kathy, what I did. They should know I'm their father, even if I've got no right to claim it." She sighed, rubbing her temple as if warding off a headache. "It's a risk, Alex. They're just starting to trust you. This could push them away, or pull them closer. Are you ready for either?" He nodded, meeting her gaze. "I have to be. It's the only way forward." After a long pause, she relented. "All right. Tomorrow then. I'll be there. But this is on you." The next day, Alexander gathered the twins in the living room. The space felt smaller somehow, the faded couch and cluttered coffee table closing in as Chris and Noah sat side by side, their lanky frames tense with curiosity. Catherine lingered by the doorway, a silent sentinel, while Sammy played upstairs, oblivious to the gravity below. Alexander stood before them, hands shoved deep in his pockets, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice unsteady. "It's about me, and your mom, and you." He took a breath, plunging into the story like a man stepping off a cliff. He told them of his love for Catherine, how they'd met at that exhibition, how they'd built a life on dreams of a family. He spoke of the years of trying, the doctor's cold verdicts, the despair that had driven a wedge between them. "I wanted kids so badly," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "When we couldn't have them, I thought I'd never be whole. So I left. I divorced your mom, thinking it was the only way. It was the biggest mistake of my life." He forced himself to look at them, their wide eyes locked on him, unblinking. "I didn't know about you then," he continued. "Not until I saw you in the park that day, playing with your mom. She told me the truth, how she used the embryos we'd frozen, how she carried you, Chris, and you, Noah. You're my sons. I'm your father, even though I haven't been there." Silence blanketed the room, thick and suffocating. The twins sat frozen, their faces a mix of shock and confusion, processing the weight of his words. Chris broke it first, his voice cutting through the stillness. "So, you're our dad?" he asked, the word dad hanging in the air like a challenge. "Yes," Alexander said, meeting his gaze. "I'm your father." Chris and Noah exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them in the way only twins could manage. Alexander couldn't read it. Were they angry, hurt, relieved? "I don't know what to say," Chris admitted, his brow furrowing. Me neither, Noah added, quieter, his fingers twisting the hem of his shirt. Alexander nodded, his throat tight. You don't have to say anything right now. Just think about it. Decide what you want, whether I'm in your lives or not. It's up to you. They nodded in unison, rising from the couch and slipping out of the room, their footsteps echoing up the stairs. He sank onto the couch, head in his hands, feeling crushed beneath the uncertainty. He'd laid his soul bare, given them everything he had. Now it was theirs to judge. The days that followed were a blur of restless waiting. He didn't see the twins, didn't call, giving them the space they needed. He haunted his apartment, sketching aimless designs, the pencil trembling in his grip, each hour stretching his nerves thinner. Then, one evening, Catherine appeared at his door, her coat dusted with twilight frost. "They want to talk to you," she said, her voice calm but edged with something he couldn't place. His heart stuttered, a mix of dread and hope surging as he followed her back to the house. The twins waited in the living room, perched on the couch like they'd been the day he'd confessed. But their expressions were different now, less guarded, more certain. Noah spoke first, his voice steady. "We talked about it. A lot. And we decided we want to get to know you better." "Yeah," Chris added, crossing his arms but softening the gesture with a small nod. "We don't know what'll come of it, how it'll work, but we're willing to try." Alexander's vision blurred, tears spilling hot down his cheeks before he could stop them. Relief and gratitude crashed over him, a tidal wave he hadn't braced for. "Thank you," he choked out, his voice breaking. "Thank you for this chance. I promise, I swear, I won't let you down." He stepped forward, hesitant, and opened his arms. The twins rose, exchanging another glance before moving into the embrace. He hugged them tight, Chris's wiry frame, Noah's slightly broader shoulders, feeling their warmth, their reality against him. They were his sons, his family, a gift he'd never thought to reclaim. Catherine watched from the doorway, a faint smile tugging at her lips, her eyes glistening. Alexander met her gaze over the boys' heads, a silent vow passing between them. He'd fight for this, for them, to the end, building something new from the ruins of his past.